In early 1945, East Prussia wasn't just a piece of land on the map. It was the hardened heart of everything Germany believed itself to be. Generations of officers were born there, men trained from a young age for war, molded by rigid discipline and the idea that duty came before life itself. Every road, every village, every snow-covered field carried decades of military tradition. It was a place where the past still breathed. But now, that past was about to be crushed. Winter enveloped everything like a veil of death. Dark forests, frozen rivers, and silent cities created an almost ghostly landscape. The wind cut across faces like invisible blades, and the cold was so intense that it froze not only skin, but hope. And yet, soldiers still dug trenches in the hardened earth, using their bare hands when tools failed. Germany at that moment was already on the verge of collapse. After devastating defeats like the Battle of Stalingrad, what remained of the army was a weary shadow of what it once was. But in East Prussia, there was still resistance. There were still men who believed that that land could not fall, that it shouldn't fall. There, officers shouted orders in hoarse voices, trying to maintain discipline among exhausted soldiers, many of them too young or too old to be there. Some barely knew how to hold a rifle. Others had seen so much horror that their eyes seemed empty, as if they were already dead inside. For the Nazi regime, losing East Prussia was more than a military defeat. It was a devastating psychological blow. It was an admission that the Reich was crumbling. Therefore, the order was clear and brutal: to resist until the last man, until the last bullet. Meanwhile, in the distance, almost like a constant thunder that never ceased, came the sound of Soviet artillery, a warning, an omen. The storm was coming, and everyone there knew East Prussia was no longer a fortress. It was a trap, and those men were trapped inside her. The red storm is approaching. The sound came first. It wasn't the usual sound of battle, those isolated gunshots or distant explosions that the soldiers had learned to ignore. It was something bigger, continuous, almost as if the earth itself were groaning. A thunder that wouldn't cease, day and night, echoing through the frozen forests of East Prussia. It was the advance of the Red Army. After years of brutal warfare in the East, since the German disaster at the Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviets had transformed into something completely different from what they were at the beginning of the conflict. They were no longer a disorganized army trying to survive. Now they were a gigantic, experienced war machine, hardened by blood and loss. Each soldier who advanced carried with them memories of destroyed cities, dead families, and a deep desire for revenge. And they were coming in strong. Endless columns of tanks cut through the snow like steel monsters, their engines roaring like hungry beasts. The Gyahu infantry followed close behind, thousands of men marching in the extreme cold, their faces hardened, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Many barely spoke. It wasn't necessary. They all knew what awaited them and what they needed to do. In the sky, Soviet planes crisscrossed the grey clouds, suddenly appearing to drop bombs on German positions. The sound of sirens tore through the silence before impact. And then came the violent explosions, shaking the ground, hurling earth, snow, and bodies into the air. Some positions simply ceased to exist. The artillery, however, was the real terror. Heavy cannons fired relentlessly, turning entire kilometers into a fiery inferno. The explosions were not spaced out. They came in sequence, one after the other, like the beats of a monstrous heart. German soldiers, hidden in shallow trenches, felt the ground tremble beneath their bodies. Some covered their ears. Others simply waited, motionless, praying not to be next. And often they were. The direct impact of a projectile left nothing behind. only a smoking hole where men had once stood. The German front line was beginning to give way, not for lack of courage, but simply because it was impossible to resist that sheer volume of force. Where there had once been organized defense, gaps were now appearing. Where there had been communication, now only silence remained. And yet, orders were coming from behind. Hold your position, don't back down, fight to the end. But how do you fight against something that seems infinite? German soldiers could see the Soviet advance in the distance, a dark mass moving slowly across the white landscape, like a stain swallowing everything in its path. It wasn't just an army, it was a human and mechanical avalanche. Each village captured, each road conquered, brought this storm ever closer. And the worst part of all was that there was nowhere to run. East Prussia was being closed in like a fist, and inside it, thousands of men awaited the inevitable. Impact, the deadly winter. The enemy did not come only from the east. He was everywhere. The winter of 1945 in East Prussia wasn't just cold, it was deadly. The air felt like it cut through the skin like glass. Breathing hurt. Each breath burned the lungs, as if the body itself were rejecting that hostile environment. Temperatures plummeted well below freezing, and the wind turned any exposure into a life-threatening risk. For the soldiers, the cold was as dangerous as the bullets. The boots, often worn out or inadequate, did not offer sufficient protection. Feet froze slowly, first numb, then lifeless. Fingers turned black, stiff, dead. Men would wake up in the morning and find they could no longer move their hands. Others simply wouldn't wake up at all. In the trenches, the situation was even worse. The ground was so hard that digging was nearly impossible. When they managed to create some shelter, it would quickly fill with ice. Dampness penetrated everything: clothes, weapons, skin. Soldiers spent days unable to dry off. Their bodies trembled incessantly, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. And then came the silence. Before a bombing, before an attack, there were moments when everything became too quiet. A heavy, almost supernatural silence. And in that silence, the cold seemed to grow even more, enveloping each man, seeping into his bones. Some were beginning to lose their lucidity. Frostbite didn't just kill the body, it confused the mind. Exhausted soldiers would take off their clothes in the snow, believing they were burning from the heat. Others would simply lie down and never get up again. All around, frozen bodies were beginning to appear in the landscape. Fallen men remained where they died, preserved by the ice. Some still held their rifles. Others had expressions of pure terror frozen on their faces. It was as if time had stopped at the exact moment of death. The vehicles were also suffering. Tanks struggled to start, engines seized, fuel froze, weapons jammed at the most critical moment. Often a soldier would pull the trigger and nothing would happen, just a dry click, and then despair. The roads have turned into traps. Covered in ice and treacherous, they swallowed vehicles and carts. Trucks got stuck or skidded, becoming easy targets. Wounded people trying to be evacuated died en route, frozen before reaching any help. And in the midst of all this, the war continued. Explosions tore through the frozen silence. Gunshots echoed among the snow-covered trees. The blood, warm as it left the body, quickly darkened and froze, mingling with the white of the ground. It was a battle fought on two levels, against the enemy and against one's own survival. And for many there, winter was more than just a backdrop. He was the cruelest executioner of all. Civilians in panic. Until then, war had been something distant for many civilians in East Prussia, an echo coming from other lands, from other peoples. But now, it was there, at the door, inside the house, breathing the same air, and fear spread like wildfire. When the first reports of the Soviet advance began to arrive, they were filled with horror. Stories of destroyed villages, looting, violence, true or exaggerated, it mattered little at that moment. The effect was immediate. Panic gripped the population, and then the escape began. Millions of people left everything behind. Homes, photos, memories, entire lives abandoned in a matter of hours. Entire families threw themselves onto the frozen roads, carrying what they could. Makeshift suitcases, bags of food, blankets. Many pulled fragile carts, crammed with children and few belongings. The scene was chaotic. Roads that were once quiet were now completely crowded. An endless multitude dragged themselves slowly through the brutal cold. The sound wasn't of engines or military orders. It was of crying, shouting, heavy footsteps in the snow. Children cried from hunger. Elderly people stumbled, unable to keep up. And there was no organization. Soldiers tried to fight their way through the crowd, but were often ignored. The instinct for survival prevailed. Everyone was thinking of only one thing: escape. But escape to where? East Prussia was surrounded. Escape routes were few, dangerous, and constantly threatened. Soviet planes appeared in the sky like predators, swooping down on columns of refugees. The sound of the engines was followed by immediate panic. People ran, threw themselves into the snow, abandoned everything. And then came the explosions. Bodies were thrown into the air. Screams mingled with the roar of the bombs. When the attack ended, the silence that remained was even worse, broken only by groans and cries. Many were unable to continue. The cold was relentless. Small children, wrapped in thin blankets, stopped moving. Desperate mothers tried to wake them, shaking their bodies, but it was too late. Some, too weak to accept it, continued carrying their dead. Children, for miles. Elderly people collapsed on the road and simply couldn't get up. Families had to make impossible decisions: stop and die together, or keep going. And many followed. Along the roads, bodies began to pile up, frozen where they fell. Men, women, children, some still with their eyes open, as if they were looking at something that would never arrive. The war had ceased to be a struggle between armies. Now it was a pure struggle for survival. And in that scenario, there were no heroes, just people trying not to die. The net is closing in. Gradually, almost without many realizing it immediately, East Prussia ceased to be a front line and turned into a complete trap. The Red Army's movement wasn't chaotic. It was precise, calculated. While one mass advanced from the front, other columns moved along the flanks, cutting roads, taking crossroads, occupying strategic villages. It was like watching a knot being slowly tightened. Each movement further reduced the space for those inside. And then the realization came. The routes were disappearing. Roads that were still open yesterday were now under Soviet control. Bridges were destroyed or captured. Railway lines ceased to function. Radio messages began to fail, and then simply disappeared. German units began to realize that they could no longer contact each other. A battalion was fighting in a forest, unaware that another unit had already been destroyed just a few kilometers away. Officers tried to reorganize defenses, but they were blind. Without information, without a complete overview, it was like fighting inside a collapsing labyrinth. And the net continued to close in. From the north, Soviet forces advanced toward the Baltic Sea, cutting off any possibility of an organized retreat. From the south, other divisions pressed with full force, crushing what remained of the German defenses. In the center, cities and towns were isolated one by one. Therefore, the truth became impossible to ignore. They were surrounded. There was no longer a continuous line of defense, only isolated pockets of resistance scattered throughout the region, each group fighting on its own without knowing how long it would last. Within these pockets, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Food began to run out, rations were reduced, soldiers shared pieces of stale bread, often frozen. Clean water was rare, some melted snow, risking disease. Others simply ignored their thirst until they could no longer bear it. Ammunition also became a problem. Shots had to be calculated. Every bullet counted. There was no more room for error. Some soldiers saved their last ammunition, not for the enemy, but for themselves, in case the situation became untenable. The wounded piled up. With no evacuation possible, many remained in their positions, lying on makeshift cloths, groaning softly. Doctors worked tirelessly with limited resources. Morphine was scarce. In many cases, the only relief was waiting for the end. And yet the orders kept coming when they came at all. Maintain position, do not back down, resist until the last man. But now, those words sounded empty, because everyone there was beginning to understand something simple and terrifying. East Prussia would not be defended. She would be sacrificed, and as the siege closed in completely like an iron jaw crushing everything around it, the fate of those men was practically sealed. The only question that remained was, how much longer would it take until the end arrived? The fanatical German defense, even surrounded, even starving, even knowing deep down that the battle was already lost. Many German soldiers continued fighting with an intensity that was almost impossible to comprehend. It was no longer a strategic defense. It was something deeper, darker. It was a defense driven by order, by fear, and for some, by pure conviction. Officers patrolled the frozen lines, shouting commands in hoarse voices, their faces etched with exhaustion. Some still believed reinforcements might arrive. Others knew they wouldn't, but they maintained their composure because breaking discipline meant immediate collapse. And then came the harshest orders. Not one step back. Whoever retreats will be executed. It was not an empty threat. In various positions, soldiers attempting to flee or abandon their posts were immediately apprehended. Sometimes arrested, other times killed by their own comrades or the military police. The front line was not only against the enemy, but also against despair itself. And yet many fought. Each village was transformed into a point of resistance. Houses became makeshift bunkers. Windows were reinforced with sandbags. Streets were blocked with debris. In some places, even children and the elderly helped, carrying ammunition, digging positions, trying in some way to delay the inevitable. The fighting was brutal and close quarters. German soldiers hid behind broken walls, waiting for the exact moment to open fire. When the Soviets advanced, they were met with short, precise bursts of gunfire. Grenades were thrown from darkened windows. For a few moments, it seemed that the resistance still had strength, but those moments were short-lived, because for every German position, dozens of Soviet soldiers advanced. If one line held, another was flanked. If one attack failed, another came immediately afterward, stronger, heavier, more relentless. And yet, they continued. There was something almost automatic about it. Exhausted soldiers reloaded their rifles, their hands trembling with cold. Some could barely feel their fingers, but they kept firing. Others, wounded, refused to leave their positions. They remained there, bleeding slowly until they could no longer move. The war had reduced everything to its essentials, to survive a few more minutes, no matter the cost. But not everyone was fighting for ideology. Many fought because they had no choice, because there was nothing left behind them. Their homes were already destroyed. Their families were fleeing or dead. Retreating didn't mean salvation. It only meant dying somewhere else. And then there was the fear of the approaching enemy, the fear of what might happen if they were captured. Stories circulated among the soldiers, stories of revenge, of brutality. True or not, they fueled a last spark of resistance. And that spark was dangerous, because it transformed ordinary men into fighters willing to fight to the end. Even when there was no longer any rational reason to continue, East Prussia was doomed. But in every street, in every destroyed house, there were still men determined to turn that end into a bloodbath. And for a brief moment, it seemed they would manage to delay the inevitable, but only for a moment. In the icy heart of East Prussia, where tree-lined avenues once snaked like veins of a proud civilization, and where historic buildings, with their neo-Gothic facades and pointed towers, echoed the Legacy of Kant and the golden amber that had enriched generations, Königsberg now stood like a condemned spectre. The city, once a symphony of Prussian order, with its impeccable squares, the Pregel River winding between stone bridges, and the ancient castle rising like a sentinel of centuries, had been reduced to a besieged fortress, a womb of stone and steel that pulsed with the palpable terror of those who knew the end was no longer a possibility, but an inescapable certainty. Thousands of souls, exhausted soldiers, starving civilians, women with children in their arms, elderly people bent under the weight of memories that no longer served any purpose, lived under the yoke of a waiting that corroded the soul like acid. East Prussia, once the bulwark of the Reich, had been cut off from the world like a gangrenous limb. The Soviet siege, relentless since the beginning of 1945, had transformed escape routes into deadly traps, and Hitler, in his detached fury, had ordered the city to resist to the last man, to the last breath, as if mere willpower could stop the approaching apocalypse. And when the final attack broke, it came not like a thief in the night, but like the roar of 1,000 demons unleashed from the abyss. There was not enough warning, no mercy in the preparation. The sky, which had previously been tinged with a leaden grey typical of a prolonged winter, darkened not from natural clouds, but from a suffocating curtain of thick, oily black smoke rising from distant fires and mingling with the frigid April air, carrying the stench of burnt fuel, charred wood, and scorched human flesh. The sound began in the distance, a deep thunder that made the ground vibrate as if the earth itself trembled with terror. Soviet artillery, with its batteries of heavy cannons lined up in endless rows for miles beyond the horizon, opening fire in unison. In a matter of minutes, that distant rumble transformed into a continuous deafening bombardment, a divine hammer that gave no respite. Explosions followed one another without pause, as if time itself had been abolished and replaced by an eternal instant of impact and annihilation. Each detonation was a punch to the chest of the world. Entire buildings, built to last for centuries, trembled on their foundations before collapsing with a guttural groan. Roofs torn off like dry leaves in the wind, windows exploding in cascades of glass that cut through the air like invisible blades. Streets paved for generations were ripped open by deep craters, irregular abysses that swallowed abandoned carts, bodies, and hopes. With each impact, a cloud of dust, dirty snow, and debris rose, creating an infernal fog that suffocated the lungs, blinded the eyes, and turned the simple act of breathing into an act of despair. Inside the damp, stuffy basements, where the air was thick as poisoned molasses, chaos was absolute and primal. Civilians, mothers with faces pale from hunger, children who no longer cried because terror had silenced them. Old men murmuring forgotten prayers, huddled together, bodies pressed together in a trembling mass of humanity reduced to animal instinct. The makeshift shelters in the underground stations, ancient crypts, and basements of abandoned factories were packed to the point of asphyxiation. The smell of sour sweat, urine, and excrement mingled with the metallic odor of fear. Above them, the world crumbled. German soldiers, their uniforms torn and eyes bloodshot with exhaustion, tried to hold defensive positions among the ruins, but the scene changed every second like a living nightmare. A building that had served as a point of resistance, perhaps an old barracks or a converted school, simply evaporated after a direct hit, transforming into a pile of bricks and twisted beams. A street that seemed safe instantly became a deadly trap of crossfire. There was no stability, no logic. The defensive line moved not out of military strategy, but because the terrain itself was being erased from the map, meter by meter, as if an angry god were wiping the city from existence. The noise was a living, omnipresent entity that penetrated bones and minds. Explosions that made eardrums bleed, piercing cries of pain that rose and died abruptly, the constant crackle of machine gun fire, the thunderous collapse of entire structures, all merged into a continuous roar, a relentless symphony of the apocalypse. Many soldiers would later confess in broken whispers that, in that hell, they could no longer distinguish sound from sound. It was like being trapped inside an eternal storm, where the wind howled with human voices and the thunder carried the weight of shattered souls. And then, as if the bombardment wasn't enough to break the human spirit, came the air raids. Soviet planes, Ilyushin and Sturmovik, metal beasts painted in winter camouflage, dived low over the shattered rooftops, releasing bombs that exploded with demonic fury, incendiary bombs that spread. Liquid fire. Entire areas caught fire. Old wood from bourgeois houses, torn fabrics from curtains and bed linens, abandoned fuel tanks. Everything fed the voracious blaze. Konigsberg began to burn like a gigantic pyre, columns of orange and red fire rising into the black sky, reflecting in the clouds of smoke, as if the firmament itself were bleeding. At night, the horizon was no longer dark. It shone in infernal hues, as if the city were being consumed alive by a dragon of flames that licked every corner, every alley, every memory. For the civilians trapped there was no escape. The roads to the west were blocked by mines and friendly fire. The Baltic Sea, once a route of hope, now echoed with the rumble of sunken ships. Women clutched their children to their chests, whispering comforting lies as the ground trembled and the ceiling cracked. The elderly stared into the void, their eyes glazed with a despair beyond words. The knowledge that everything they had lived for, the Prussia they had loved, was being reduced to ashes. For the soldiers, there was no retreat. They fought amidst total collapse, defending what remained of a city already doomed. Each temporary position, each minute of resistance paid for with rivers of young and old blood. The air carried the weight of an inescapable truth. Königsberg was no longer a city. It was a colossal execution field, a slaughterhouse where destiny was written in fire and lead, and everyone inside it, the innocent and the guilty, the strong and the weak, was in the exact center of hell, where fear was not an emotion but the air one breathed. Despair was not a feeling but the blood that ran in the veins, and terror was the very pulse of the heart that refused to stop. Brutal urban combat. When the Titanic bombardment finally subsided, not out of mercy, but because the cannons needed reloading and the planes needed refueling, it brought no relief. It brought something worse, something more intimate, more visceral, more inescapable. The momentary silence broken by new sounds, close, human, and therefore infinitely more deadly. The crunch of boots on uneven rubble, the metallic click of magazines being loaded, short, hoarse voices in quick, guttural orders echoing between the shattered walls. The enemy had arrived, no longer as a distant force on the horizon, but as a living presence, breathing, hunting in the shadows of the dying city. Inside Königsberg, war had ceased to be an abstraction of lines on a map, of divisions and flanks. Now it was direct confrontation, man against man, just meters, sometimes centimeters, apart. There was no longer a defined front, no safe rear. The city had transformed into a labyrinth of living death, a maze of ruins where every street was a deadly risk, every corner an open mouth, ready to devour lives. The once elegant buildings with their high halls and marble staircases were now hollow shells, narrow corridors of deep shadows, blind spots on all sides. And it was in these claustrophobic spaces that the fighting unfolded, not as a glorious battle, but as primal carnage. German soldiers, their faces grimy with soot and sweat, positioned themselves inside partially destroyed structures. Irregular holes in the walls became makeshift sites. Broken ladders served as lethal ambushes. They waited in absolute silence, controlling their breathing until their lungs burned, listening to every footstep shattering glass, every distant whisper, their hearts pounding like an execution drum. until the right moment, and when the enemy appeared, it was swift, brutal, merciless. Short bursts of machine gun fire tore through the air, grenades launched just meters away, exploding in clouds of fragments that ripped off limbs and hope. Screams cut short by precise shots. Everything happened in seconds. There was no time to think, to pray, to hesitate, only to react like cornered animals. The Soviets advanced with a force and aggression that seemed to spring from the devastated land itself. They entered buildings without hesitation, clearing every floor, every room, every dark corner with methodical fury. A locked door was broken down with a shoulder or explosive. Resistance was crushed with suppressive fire and bayonets. In many cases, the fighting took place inside small rooms, abandoned kitchens, or once peaceful bedrooms, where there was no space even to retreat a step. It was fighting on the edge of human endurance, hand-to-hand combat, knives gleaming. In the dark, rifle butts crushing skulls, bare hands squeezing throats until the last gasp. Soldiers clung to the ground, rolled in mud mixed with melted snow and warm blood, fought like beasts, while the victor was often simply the one who could still move after the clash. The other left there, eyes glazed over at the cracked ceiling, life ebbing away in red puddles. The smell was suffocating, indescribable, acrid gunpowder burning the nostrils, dense smoke from nearby fires, pulverized concrete that entered the throat like sand, and above all the metallic, sweet and nauseating odor of fresh blood that soaked uniforms, floors and walls. In enclosed spaces, visibility was minimal. Dust and smoke transformed the air into an opaque veil, where men fired in shadows, killing friends or enemies indiscriminately. And worst of all, there was no rest. A position conquered at the cost of lives did not mean security. Counterattacks came in rapid, ferocious waves. A captured building could be lost minutes later, control of the city constantly shifting, meter by meter of blood. Wounded men piled up in dark corners, forgotten in the frenzy of battle. Some cried for help with hoarse voices that were lost in the chaos. Others groaned softly, trying not to attract attention, knowing that a loud cry could attract a grenade. Many died right there, alone, their blood clotting in the cold, their eyes fixed on a ceiling that didn't respond. And in the midst of all this, the psychological state began to unravel like rotten fabric. Soldiers no longer knew how long they had been fighting. Hours seemed like days. Days seemed like an endless eternity. The exhaustion was extreme, a weight that crushed bones and soul. The mind, overwhelmed with images of death, collapsed. Some acted almost automatically, like broken machines, reloading and firing unconsciously. Others simply stopped. They sat amidst the rubble, rifles abandoned in their laps, empty eyes staring into nothingness, unable to continue, as if reality had shattered and they floated in a limbo of absolute despair. But the war did not stop, because in Konigsberg, in that abyss of ruins and fire, there was no room for weakness, for humanity. The city was being devoured alive. Building by building, street by street, room by room, each piece conquered cost lives, many lives. Lives of young people who dreamed of victory and now lay cold among the bricks. The lives of civilians were being dragged through the cargo holds, praying that the next impact wouldn't be their last. The terror was total, absolute. Every shadow could be death. Every silence, the calm before the final storm. Despair seeped into their veins like poison, knowing that surrender was not an option, that the siege was complete, that the outside world had abandoned them. Hidden women heard the heavy footsteps above, whispering to their children to be quiet, while their hearts pounded so hard they seemed to echo off the walls. Soldiers saw comrades fall, familiar faces reduced to masks of agony, and felt the dread that soon it would be their turn, without glory, without honor, only oblivion in a mass grave of rubble. Königsberg was not only falling physically, It was crumbling in the soul of every human being within its walls. It was urban hell incarnate, where man fought not against an army, but against the very end of civilization, against the abyss that swallowed everything that remained of dignity, of hope, of future. And there, meter by meter, the battle continued, relentless, until the last cry was silenced, and silence at last reigned over the ashes of a city that had once dared to dream of eternity. Soviet superiority. If, until that moment, there still remained, in some fragile corner of the German soul, a last illusion of equilibrium, a shred of hope that courage, discipline, and cunning could compensate for the losses, that illusion was obliterated like dust under the weight of a cosmic hammer, inside and around. Königsberg. The war revealed its rawest, most merciless, most mathematical face. It was no longer a matter of bravery or well-chosen defensive positions. It was a matter of volume, of mass, of an overwhelming power that poured over the besieged city like an avalanche of steel and fire, endless, merciless, without the possibility of real counterattack. It was Soviet superiority embodied in numbers that defied human reason, a red tide that did not retreat, did not hesitate, did not care about the cost in its own lives, because it knew that the enemy had nothing left to offer but blood and despair. The Soviets did not attack in small, isolated units, as in battles of yesteryear, where man could still dream of an honorable duel. They came in waves, successive, inexorable waves that seemed to spring from the snowy horizon itself, like an army emerging from the depths of hell. First, always first, the artillery, an orchestra of death that made the air tremble even before the first projectile fell. Hundreds, no, thousands of cannons of all calibers lined up in endless batteries beyond the siege lines, firing in unison, creating a curtain of fire so dense that the sky turned into a sheet of continuous explosions. It was not a bombardment to weaken positions. It was a bombardment to extinguish, to eradicate, to transform streets, squares, and basements into a smoldering void. Buildings already damaged by previous attacks were reduced to fine dust that hung in the air like poisonous snow. Structures that still stood, stubborn as the bones of an ancient skeleton, simply gave way with a prolonged, agonizing groan, collapsing in clouds of rubble that buried the living and the dead together. The ground trembled continuously, without pause, as if the very earth of East Prussia were about to open into an abyss that would swallow everything: soldiers, civilians, memories, the Prussian pride that had once echoed in the halls of Konigsberg castle. And when the bombardment ceased, for those few treacherous seconds of silence that seemed a cruel blessing, they advanced. Tanks emerged through the dense smoke, enormous, heavy, almost unreal amidst that apocalyptic ruin. Their tracks crushed everything that remained: charred wood, pulverized concrete, inert bodies that were once men with names and dreams. The sound of metal against the rubble was a guttural, brutal roar that vibrated in the bones of the hidden defenders, a warning that death now had wheels and cannons. Behind them, the infantry. Hundreds, thousands of Soviet soldiers advancing together, shoulder to shoulder, seizing every second of confusion after the bombardment to break through the German lines before they could reorganize. They ran, shouted, fired, grenades flying in precise arcs, bayonets gleaming in the glare of the fires. They knew that this was the moment to break the enemy's spirit, to transform resistance into panic. For the Germans, it was a nightmare repeated endlessly, a cycle of torment that eroded their sanity. They positioned themselves among the rubble, waited with their finger on the trigger, tried to resist with what little ammunition they had left and their exhausted courage. But when the attack came, it was overwhelming. Even if they managed to destroy a tank with a desperate Panzerfaust, 2 or 3 more would appear right behind it, emerging from the fog like indestructible monsters. Even if they took down a group of infantry with precise bursts of machine gun fire, another platoon would instantly take its place, trampling the fallen without looking back. It was a fight against something that didn't stop, that didn't care about losses, that seemed endless. And worst of all, what transformed fear into a chilling terror that settled in their guts was the increasing precision. The Soviets had learned. They had paid with rivers of blood in previous years, and now they applied this lesson with surgical coldness. Unlike the early years of the war, when the momentum was brutal and disorganized, now their attacks were coordinated like a deadly symphony. Artillery prepared the ground, tanks cleared the way, infantry cleaned up what remained. They worked together in an almost perfect rhythm, exploiting every weakness with the patience of predators who knew that time was on their side. German defenses, already weakened by hunger and isolation, began to crumble more rapidly, more irreversibly. Lines that had previously held for hours, for entire days, now collapsed in minutes. Communications failed under the weight of interference and explosions. Commanders lost control of their units. Orders arrived too late or never arrived at all, lost in the chaos of cut wires and dead messengers. Inside the city, this became even more evident, more suffocating. A building defended by a small German unit, perhaps 10 exhausted men with sunken eyes and trembling hands, could hold out for a while, exchanging precise shots through shattered windows. But then came the artillery, reducing the walls to rubble. Then the tanks, crushing the barricades, and finally the infantry, storming the rooms with fury. It was a deadly, almost inevitable sequence, a ritual of destruction that repeated itself in every block, on every street. And when the position fell, there was no recovery. No counterattack was possible. The advance continued, relentless, meter by meter, transforming the city into a sea of red ruins. The German soldiers began to feel it, not only in their minds, but in their entire bodies. A weariness that went beyond their muscles, a weakness that spread like poison. No matter how much they fought, how much they bled, how many hoarse orders they shouted, it wasn't enough. Some still resisted with everything they had, firing until their last bullet, fighting hand to hand until their hands broke and their vision blurred. But others began to perceive reality with a painful clarity, sharp as glass. They were being crushed, not defeated in a fair battle, where honor could still be saved, crushed by a much greater power, a war machine that saw them as mere obstacles to be swept away. And in the midst of this collapse, a feeling began to spread silently through the German ranks. Something more dangerous than pure fear, more corrosive than immediate terror, certainty, the icy, inescapable certainty that there was no possible victory, the certainty that this was no longer a heroic defense. It was the end of everything they knew, the end of a Prussia that died not with a glorious bang, but with the constant roar of enemy tanks and the ever-deepening silence of men who knew they were doomed. The collapse of German morality. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A whisper in the icy wind, blowing through the ruins, a fleeting shadow in the eyes of a soldier who, for a second, hesitated before pulling the trigger. It wasn't a mass retreat, nor a collective cry of surrender echoing through the shattered streets. It was something quieter, slower, and for that very reason, infinitely more dangerous. An internal wear and tear, an invisible corrosion that began to devour the German soldiers from within, piece by piece, soul by soul, transforming warriors into empty shells, still clutching rifles with trembling hands. Within the ruins of Konigsberg and the isolated pockets of East Prussia, those frozen patches of land where the Reich still pretended to resist, reality could no longer be ignored, nor masked by grandiose speeches or promises of Wunderwaffen. They were alone, totally, desperately alone, without reinforcements arriving by sea or air, without escape routes that didn't end in mines or enemy fire, without real hope of victory. Only the distant order from Berlin to resist to the last man, as if sacrifice could rewrite the already sealed destiny. And when a soldier understands this, When the truth penetrates the flesh like a cold blade, something changes forever. In the beginning, there was still discipline. Orders were obeyed with the automatism of those trained to follow. Positions were held. Attacks were answered with what little ammunition remained. But as the endless days and nights passed, the constant pressure, the bone-chilling cold, the hunger gnawing at the stomach like a living animal, the extreme exhaustion that turned every movement into agony, and the fear that never slept, began to break even the most resilient, the most loyal, those who once marched with chests puffed, out with Prussian pride. Hunger was a constant presence, a sadistic companion that settled in their chests and wouldn't leave. Rations dwindled each day, reduced to crumbs that barely sustained their bodies. A piece of hard bread, stiffened by the ice, had to be divided among 5 or 6 men, cut with rusty knives under hungry gazes. Some scraped frozen remains from the ground, mixing dirty snow with rotten potato peels. Others, in growing desperation, ate anything they could find, horses dead. For days, rats caught in the ruins, bark from trees that once shaded elegant avenues. Their bodies weakened, their muscles trembled, their vision blurred, and with it, the will to keep fighting dissolved like smoke in the wind. Sleep was almost non-existent, a luxury that the hell of Konigsberg had banished. Constant explosions, gunfire echoing in narrow corridors, the cries of wounded men agonizing without help. There was no real rest. Even when a man managed to close his eyes for a few minutes, leaning against a cracked wall, he was abruptly awakened by a new attack, his heart pounding like an execution drum. The mind never switched off, never recovered. It remained trapped in an eternal loop of images. Dead comrades with open eyes, civilian children crying in dark basements, the face of a mother or wife who might never be seen again. And then came the thoughts. Thoughts that were once ignored with iron discipline, now took over the soul like weeds in fertile soil. Why are we still fighting? Does this make any sense, or are we just fodder for the Soviet mill? Does anyone in Berlin still care about what happens here, or have we been abandoned like old dogs? These questions weren't asked aloud. The fear of being accused of defeatism still lingered like a shadow of the distant Gestapo, but they were there, in every empty gaze lost on the horizon of flames, in every imperceptible hesitation before firing, in every second of silence between a shouted order and its reluctant execution. Some soldiers simply began to stop. They didn't flee. They didn't shout treason. They just ceased to react. They sat among the rubble, rifles dropped in their laps, eyes fixed on nothing, as if they were no longer there. Their bodies still breathed, still bled if wounded, but their minds had given up, floating in a limbo of absolute hopelessness where the world was reduced to ruins and silence. Others tried to escape. Small groups moved away from their positions during the darkest night, crawling through the blood-stained snow, searching for some miraculous path to the west. But few succeeded. Many were captured, dragged back, or executed on the spot. Others simply disappeared into the white vastness, swallowed by the cold that petrified them into ice statues. And there were also those who continued fighting, but in a different way, without hope, without conviction, just by animal instinct, the same instinct that makes a wounded animal bite, even knowing that death is coming. They shot because they were being attacked. They retreated because there was no way to advance. They survived minute by minute, without thinking about tomorrow, without dreaming of victory, just existing in a grey void where fear and exhaustion merged into a single feeling of futility. The officers saw it happening. Some tried to maintain order with hoarse shouts, threats of execution, even physical violence, slaps, kicks, orders shouted with saliva on their lips. Others no longer had the strength for that. They looked at their men with eyes that reflected the same inner breakdown and knew they were asking for the impossible, because it was no longer about military discipline. It was something deeper, more primal. It was the end of belief. The belief that they were defending something that could still be saved. The belief that this sacrifice had meaning, that East Prussia was worth the price of their young lives. And when that belief disappears, when the heart stops believing, the army ceases to exist as a real force. What remains are only men, exhausted beyond bearability, starved to the point of madness, broken to the core, waiting, consciously or unconsciously, for the final moment, the instant when the last shot would be fired, the last building would fall, and silence would finally descend upon Königsberg like a cold shroud, covering the dead dreams of a Reich crumbling into ashes and blood. Aqueda de Konigsberg. The end didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. First, one sector of the city stopped responding, then another, and yet another. Inside Königsberg, German resistance began to fragment, like glass being pressed until it shattered completely. The Soviets knew exactly what they were doing. There was no chaotic rush. The advance was methodical, cold, relentless. Each block was isolated, bombed, invaded, and taken. Then the next, and the next. There was no room for German reorganization. There was no time to breathe. The city was being dismantled. The last defensive positions began to fall one by one. Fortifications that had been prepared to withstand weeks were destroyed in hours. Bunkers were hit directly by heavy artillery. Entrances were blocked. Those inside often had no way out, and yet some resisted. Small groups of German soldiers continued fighting among the rubble, surrounded on all sides. They fired from shattered windows, from basements, from dark corridors. They knew there was no chance of victory, but they continued. It was the last vestige of resistance, but the weight of the Soviet attack was simply too great. Tanks advanced through the destroyed streets, firing on any point of resistance. Infantry followed close behind, clearing what remained. There were no more lines, only isolated pockets being crushed one by one. The German command within the city began to crumble. Communication was virtually non-existent. Orders were not arriving. Units fought without coordination. Officers tried to maintain some form of control, but they were blind, deaf, disconnected. And then came the inevitable, the surrender. It wasn't a grand moment. There was no ceremony. It was silent, almost suffocated by the chaos around it. The last commanders understood that continuing to fight meant only more senseless deaths. Without enough ammunition, without food, without any hope of reinforcements, there was nothing left to defend. The order has been given, and gradually weapons began to be put down. For many soldiers, that moment did not bring immediate relief. I brought it empty. They had fought to the limit. They had seen everything around them destroyed. They had lost friends, comrades, parts of themselves, and now it was simply over. Or at least it seemed that way. Because for many, the suffering was not yet over. As the German soldiers left their positions, they looked around, and what they saw was no longer a city. Königsberg had ceased to exist as it was known. All that remained were ruins. Smoke, silence, broken only by distant cracking sounds and collapsing structures. Bodies were scattered everywhere, mixed with the wreckage. The smell of death was heavy, constant. The sky still bore the marks of the fires. It was difficult to recognize anything. It's hard to believe that normal life ever existed there. The fall of Königsberg was not just a military defeat. It was the collapse of a symbol. The heart of East Prussia had stopped beating, and with him, a fundamental part of the Reich itself had also died. But outside the city, the tragedy continued. The massacre on the escape roads. Even after the fall of Königsberg, the war did not end for those who never held a weapon in their hands. For civilians, the worst was yet to come. The roads of East Prussia had turned into frozen human rivers. Endless columns of refugees continued to move slowly, or attempt to move, toward any place that seemed distant from the Soviet advance. There was no clear destination, only the hope of not being left. behind. But what they found along the way was death. The cold remained relentless. The wind cut like invisible blades. Snow and ice covered everything, hiding dangers and bodies. People walked for hours, sometimes days, without enough food, without rest, without real protection from the weather. And then came the attacks. Soviet planes appeared in the sky without warning, descending rapidly on columns of civilians. There was no defense, there was no shelter, only panic. The sound of the engines was followed by desperate screams. People dropped their belongings, ran in all directions, threw themselves to the ground, trying to disappear into the snow. But there was nowhere to run. The bombs were falling into the middle of the crowd. Explosions tore through the white silence, hurling bodies and debris into the air. Wagons were destroyed. Animals panicked. Children were separated from their families in seconds. And when the attack ended, what remained was even worse. A heavy silence, broken only by groans. Bodies scattered across the road, some motionless, others trying to crawl. Mothers calling for children who didn't respond. People walking aimlessly in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. But the horror didn't just come from the sky. On the ground, the situation was equally cruel. Many simply couldn't go on. The cold drained every last drop of energy. Young children stopped reacting. Elderly people fell and never got up again. And in many cases, there was no choice. The families needed to move on. To stop meant to die together. And so impossible decisions were made. Parents left their children, children left their parents. People looked back for the last time and kept walking. Along the roads, the bodies began to pile up. Frozen in place where they fell, they formed a silent trail of death. Some were still sitting. Others lay there as if they were sleeping, but they weren't. The ice preserved everything. Expressions of pain, out of fear, out of desperation. It was like walking through an endless cemetery, and yet the march continued. Broken down carts were abandoned. Luggage was left behind to lighten the load. What was once important, clothes, belongings, memories, now meant nothing. It all came down to one thing, to stay alive for a few more hours. Some tried to get off the main roads, seeking alternative routes. But this often meant getting lost, getting stuck in the snow or falling directly into combat zones. There was no safe path. The whole of East Prussia had been transformed into a deadly trap, and in the midst of this scenario, the war showed its cruelest face. Not against soldiers, but against those who never had a choice to be there. And while the military world was nearing its end, for these civilians, the suffering was far from over. Despair in the Baltic. When roads ceased to be an option, the sea remained. The Baltic Sea, cold, grey and merciless, became the last hope for hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers still trying to escape the total collapse of East Prussia. The idea seemed simple. Reach the coast, embark, cross, escape the Soviet advance. But the reality was very different. The ports were in absolute chaos. Crowds pressed into the boarding areas, pushing, shouting, begging for a place. Entire families clung tightly to one another, afraid of getting lost in the desperate mass. Children cried, the elderly could barely stand. Wounded soldiers were carried as best they could, and there wasn't enough organization to control that. Officials tried to impose some order, but it was nearly impossible. Each arriving ship seemed too small for the number of people trying to board, and everyone knew there might not be another one. Then despair would take over. People were forced aboard, climbing the sides of boats, being pulled by unknown arms, or simply trampled in their attempts to get in. Luggage was abandoned. All that mattered was getting a space, any space. And even then, many were left behind. When the ships finally departed, overcrowded far beyond capacity, a silence fell over those who remained on the dock. A heavy silence, laden with a single certainty. That may have been the last chance. At sea, the situation was no longer safe. The ships moved slowly through the icy waters, overloaded and unstable. The cold penetrated everything. Passengers huddled on decks, in corridors, in any available space. Many lacked adequate shelter from the biting wind. Children shivered. Adults tried to warm themselves as best they could, sharing body heat, but the greatest danger came from below. Soviet submarines patrolled those waters, and when they attacked, it was fast, a dry impact, an explosion, and then panic. Ships that had been hit began to list. People screamed, ran, and pushed each other in search of a way out. Some tried to reach lifeboats, few in number, insufficient and often unusable in the chaos. And then the ice. Falling into those waters was a near immediate death sentence. The thermal shock paralyzed the body in seconds. Breathing became impossible. Movement slowed until it stopped completely. Many couldn't even scream. They simply disappeared. Others remained on the surface for a few moments, desperately trying to stay alive, grabbing anything that floated. But the cold was faster, and silence returned. A profound silence, broken only by the sound of the ship sinking and by the few survivors still fighting against. The inevitable. The Baltic Sea has turned into a frozen graveyard. Bodies were swallowed by the dark waters. Entire stories vanished there, without record, without farewell. Whole families ceased to exist in a matter of minutes. And yet, the ships kept setting sail, because for those who were still on the coast, gazing at the horizon, there was still a small flame of hope, a chance to escape, even knowing that at any moment, that hope could sink along with them. The end of German defenses in the East. After everything, the siege, the cold, the bombing, the collapse of Königsberg, the moment arrived when there was nothing left to defend. East Prussia had fallen, not entirely, not temporarily, but definitively. The last pockets of German resistance, scattered among forests, destroyed villages, and small makeshift fortifications, began to disappear one by one. Some fought to their last bullet. Others, exhausted without food, ammunition, or leadership, simply gave up. The German defensive structure in the East no longer exists. What was once an organized line with divisions, communication, and strategy was now just disconnected fragments, small, isolated groups without coordination, without direction, without any real impact on the enemy advance. And the Soviet advance did not stop. On the contrary, he accelerated. Without a solid line to contain the attack, the Red Army began to move with even greater speed. Roads were taken quickly. Bridges crossed almost, unopposed. Smaller towns fell in a matter of hours. It was like a dam that finally broke. Everything that had held back that pressure for so long simply gave way. And with that, a new reality was brutally imposed. The road to Berlin was open. There was no longer a significant barrier between the Soviet advance and the heart of the Reich. What remained of Germany was now exposed, vulnerable, without enough time to reorganize an effective defense. The remaining German soldiers began to retreat, not in an organized withdrawal, but in a fragmented flight. Small groups trying to reach the West, trying to escape capture, trying to survive. But many couldn't. They were overtaken, surrounded, or they simply no longer had the strength to continue. For them, the war ended there. Meanwhile, the German commanders knew that this was a decisive moment. There were no more strategic illusions. There were no more plans for reversal. All that remained was to try to delay the inevitable, to buy time, days, perhaps hours. But the end was already in motion. For the Soviets, this was more than just a military victory. It was revenge. It was the result of years of destruction within their own territory. Each city taken, each position crushed, carried with it the weight of everything that had been lost since 1941. And now they were inside Germany. The collapse of East Prussia was not just a regional defeat. It was the collapse of the last major German defense in the East, a breaking point. After him, there was no going back. The war was entering its final phase, and what would come next would be even more devastating. the prelude to the end of the Reich. After the fall of East Prussia, the silence that followed was not one of peace. It was the silence before the end. The destruction of Königsberg and the complete collapse of the defenses in the east made one thing clear, beyond any room for doubt: the Reich was dying, not slowly, but inevitably. Now, the road to Berlin was open, and everyone knew it. On the Soviet side, the advance continued like an unstoppable tide. Troops crossed German territory almost without encountering organized resistance. What remained of the German army no longer had the strength to mount a solid defensive line. Each attempt was quickly broken. It was like trying to stop an avalanche with your bare hands. On the German side, the scene was one of total collapse. Cities filled with refugees from the east, carrying tales of horror, destruction, and death. These stories spread rapidly, creating an all-consuming climate of fear. Civilians gazed at the horizon with the feeling that the same fate was approaching. And it was. The soldiers who were still fighting no longer spoke of victory. They were talking about time. How much time was left? How many hours? How many days until it was all over? Some still blindly followed orders, defending positions they knew had no real value. Others fought only to protect civilians, trying to buy precious minutes so that more people could escape. And there were those who no longer fought for anything other than survival. The German leadership, detached from the reality of the front, still insisted on total resistance. Orders continued to be issued. Defend to the last man. Do not back down. Win or die. But those words no longer carried the same weight, because on the battlefield, the truth was too obvious to ignore. The end had come. And then, slowly, the scenario began to change. The war was still brutal, still bloody, still destroying everything in its path, but now it had a clear direction, an inevitable destiny. Berlin, the Reich's capital, was becoming the last major stage of that conflict in the east. Everything that remained, soldiers, resources, hope, was being drawn to that final point. And those who had survived the hell of East Prussia carried something with them. Not just physical scars, but memories from the deadly cold, from the roads covered in bodies of the destroyed cities, from the screams that still echoed in my mind. They knew what was coming because they had already seen the end begin. The collapse of East Prussia was not just another chapter in the war. That was the final warning. The moment when the Third Reich ceased to be a warring power and became merely a crumbling empire awaiting the final blow. And this coup, I was already on my way. East Prussia did not fall solely under the weight of tanks, artillery, and men. She collapsed under the weight of her own history. There, in that cruel winter of 1945, it wasn't just a region that disappeared from the map. It was the end of an idea. The end of a belief built up over generations. The belief that the Reich was invincible, eternal, destined to dominate. But war does not respect pride. She destroys everything. The frozen forests witnessed the relentless advance of an army that could no longer be stopped. The cities, reduced to ashes, held the echoes of cries that would never be forgotten. The roads, covered in snow and death, told the story of those who tried to flee and failed. And at the center of it all, men. Soldiers who fought to the limit of their bodies and minds. Civilians dragged into a nightmare they never asked to be a part of. Families destroyed. Lives interrupted. Stories erased in a matter of seconds. The collapse of East Prussia was more than just a military defeat. It was the moment when war ceased to be merely a dispute between armies and revealed without masks its true cost. A price paid in blood, in suffering, in lost humanity. When Konigsberg fell, it wasn't just a city that ceased to exist as we knew it. It was a symbol that was crushed, a heart that stopped beating amidst the ruins. And when the road to Berlin opened up, the fate of the Third Reich was already sealed. What came next was merely the final act, but the real turning point happened there, in the snow-stained red, in the skies engulfed in flames. In the shadows of a land that could no longer be defended, East Prussia was not merely conquered, it was destroyed, so that the end could begin. And as the world moved toward the end of the war, that place remained a silent reminder, frozen in time. Which empires can fall? Because wars have no real winners, and that in the end, all that remains are echoes and memories that never cease to haunt.